In the 16th century, while Europe was consuming itself with religious wars and the Americas were being dismembered by conquistadors, West Africa was building empires, not the fledgling, contested, border-shifting entities that European political history called empires, kingdoms that rose and fell with the fortunes of a single dynasty, whose authority rarely extended more than a few days' march from the capital. West African empires of the medieval and early modern period were the genuine article vast political and commercial entities whose authority stretched across thousands of kilometers of savanna and forest and desert, whose administrative sophistication rivaled anything the contemporary world could offer, whose commercial networks connected the gold and salt and kola nut and enslaved people of the African interior to the markets of North Africa, the Levant, and through the trans-Saharan trade routes to the wider world. The greatest of these empires, Mali, Songhai, Kanoum Bornu, are becoming better known in the modern world's belated recovery of African historical achievement. Their stories are extraordinary, but this story belongs to a smaller stage, and to a woman who, on that smaller stage, achieved something that the rulers of the great empires rarely managed: the transformation of a single city-state, through the sheer force of military genius and personal will, into the dominant power of an entire region. Her name was Amina. She was the queen of Zazzau, the Hausa. It's a city-state that occupied the territory of what is now Zaria in northern Nigeria. One of the 7 great Hausa states whose network of walled cities and commercial highways formed the political geography of the central Sudan in the period between the fall of the Songhai Empire and the rise of the Fulani Jihad states of the 19th century. The Hausa world of the 16th century was a world of intense commercial competition, shifting political alliances between city-states that each controlled a section of the trans-Saharan trade routes, constant low-level military pressure. As each state sought to expand its territorial control and its tax base at the expense of its neighbors, it was not a world that invited timidity. Zazzau sat at the southern edge of the Hausa state network, the point where the savanna grasslands of the Sudan began to give way to the more forested zones of what is now central Nigeria. This geographic position was both a vulnerability and an opportunity. The southern trade routes, the routes that connected the Hausa cities to the forest kingdoms further south, to the sources of kola, nut, and forest products that the northern markets wanted, to the peoples who could supply enslaved labor for the trans-Saharan trade, all passed through or near Zazzau's territory. Whoever controlled Zazzau controlled the gateway. The city itself, the walled urban center whose mud brick architecture and dense commercial quarter contained the workshops and the markets and the administrative institutions of a Hausa city-state at its medieval peak, was a sophisticated place. The market at Zazzau drew traders from across the central Sudan and beyond. The court of the Sarki, the ruler, was a center of political and commercial intelligence, a place where information about the wider world flowed in through the merchants and the diplomats and the pilgrims passing through on the route to Mecca. And above the market and above the court, in the period just before Amina's accession, the political situation was threatening to become catastrophic. The Songhai Empire, the great Sahelian superpower whose authority had reached from the Atlantic coast of West Africa to the borders of modern Nigeria, whose court at Gao had been one of the most sophisticated political environments in the 15th and early 16th century world, was in terminal decline. The Moroccan invasion of 1591, that would formally end Songhai's dominance, had not yet occurred in the period of Amina's military career, but the empire's internal fractures were already visible, its ability to project power into the Hausa states already compromised, as the tributary relationships that had connected Zazzau and its neighbors to the larger Sahelian political system already loosening. The space that Songhai's decline was opening was a vacuum. Vacuums in political history do not remain empty. They are filled by whoever is willing to move into them with sufficient force and sufficient intelligence to hold what they take. Amina was willing, and she had both. She would campaign for 3 decades. She would extend Zazzau's authority from its walled capital south to the Niger and Benue rivers in east and west across the breadth of the central Sudan. She would build walls, the earthen, fortifications that her armies constructed around every conquered camp, the structures that the Hausa historical tradition calls Ganuwar Amina, the walls of Amina, whose remains are still visible in the landscape of northern Nigeria as a literal physical record of the geography of her ambition. She would never lose a battle. She would never marry. She would take a lover from each town she conquered and, by the tradition that her story preserves, execute him in the morning, refusing the specific vulnerability that a living consort represented, refusing the dilution of her authority that a husband would have required, refusing everything that the world offered her, except the one thing she wanted. Powered territory. Victory. Amin was born into power, not power in the abstract. Comfortable sense of a royal birth that guarantees position and privilege without demanding anything in return. Power in the specific, dangerous, demanding sense of the Hausa political tradition, a world where the Saruda, the ruling office, was a prize constantly contested by competing lineages, where queens and princes and ambitious officials moved through the political landscape with the specific alertness of people who knew that position was never permanently secure, and that the skills required to obtain it were also required to keep it. Her mother was Bakwa Turunku. This is the essential biographical fact that shapes everything that follows. Kua Turunku was not merely a queen consort, Kua Tua, not merely the wife of a Sarki who derived her status from her husband's position. She was a ruler in her own right, the Sarauniya, the female ruler of Zazzau, who governed the state from approximately 1536 to 1566 CE, with a competence and a political intelligence that the Hausa oral historical tradition preserved as the benchmark, against which subsequent female leadership was measured. Bakwa Turunku was a builder. The founding of the city of Turunku, a settlement that bears her name in the Hausa historical geography of the region, is attributed to her. The specific act of city founding that in the Hausa political tradition represents the highest expression of a ruler's capacity to shape the material world. She also maintained the peace during her reign, consolidating Zazzau's position in the competitive Hausa political environment through diplomacy and commercial management, rather than military expansion, a strategic choice that reflected both the specific political conditions of her era and her own assessment of where Zazzau's interests lay. Her daughter watched. Amina, born approximately 1533 CE, the eldest child of Bakwa Turunku, raised in the palace of Zazzau with the specific education that the Hausa political tradition provided for the children of rulers, learned from her mother the essential lessons of political authority, how to manage the court, how to balance the competing interests of the major lineages and the powerful officials whose cooperation the ruler required, how to read the commercial intelligence that the market brought into the city every trading day, how to project authority without provoking the specific kind of resistance that authority exercised without. Judgment inevitably generates, but Amina also learned something that her mother's peaceful reign could not fully teach. She learned war. The Hausa political tradition of the period was not pacifist. The city-states maintained military forces, conducted raids against surrounding peoples, and engaged in the periodic conflicts that the competition for trade routes and agricultural territory required. The military establishment of a Hausa city-state was a significant institution, with its own internal hierarchy, its own traditions of service and honor, its own relationship to the political authority of the Sarki, whose campaigns it prosecuted. Amina entered that establishment. The Hausa oral historical tradition preserves the specific memory of her military training, the young princess, who was not content with the domestic and administrative education that the female members of the royal house typically received, who sought and was given access to the training that produced the cavalry commanders and the infantry leaders, who were the military backbone of Zazzau's armed force. She learned to ride. She learned to fight. She learned the specific tactical and logistical knowledge that military command in the Hausa tradition required, the management of cavalry, the organization of supply, the selection of ground, the psychology of leadership that turns a collection of armed men into a force that will follow its commander into danger. She excelled. The tradition records her early military participation, accompanying raids and campaigns in a subordinate capacity, before her own authority was established. Learning the craft of war through observation and practice with the specific intensity of someone who understood that this knowledge was not an accomplishment to be displayed at court, but a survival skill that the political world she inhabited would eventually demand she use. The political transition came when Bakwa Turunku died. The succession to Zazzau passed not to Amina, the eldest child, the daughter